For our next session, we've invited our global financial services cybersecurity leader all the way from the UK. With 22 years in the business, he started his career in tech, went on to combat cybercrime, and is now mainly focused on educating executives on risk. Please welcome Alex Petsopoulos.
Good afternoon, everyone. Matt, good effort, struggling with that cold. Good presentation. There's a lot of stuff I'm going to talk about that plays on what Matt talked about. Whereas he was at the detail, the technical issues, I'm now going to elevate to the strategic level for this particular presentation. So, taking a step back, if we look at our industry, there are 4 strategic themes that we are wrestling with, and I'm going to focus on one of them, but I just thought I'd set a bit of context. We've already talked a lot about resilience as a new standard. We've seen attacks really impacting individuals, whether it's Colonial Pipeline and people in the southeast of the US couldn't get their cars refueled, UK and Irish health services, medical appointments being cancelled, and interesting TravelX sector I focus on, one of the largest currency exchange service providers, they went bust off the back of ransomware. So, no surprise, resilience is matching, if not trumping, data privacy concerns for a lot of people. There is a new social contract that's developing between the government and the private sector because the geopolitical concerns, the conflicts, there's a lot of concern, but the levers of control mostly reside in the private sector. And, whether it's the East-West battle for tech supremacy, like we saw with the chips, supply chain concerns, shortages, disruptions, and obviously the geopolitical stuff going on. A lot of these things we are reliant on the private sector to solve. So there is an expectation, an obligation for better collaboration between the private sector and government. We've heard a lot about cyber is at the heart of business disruption. We've heard a lot about cloud and identity. We've heard about AI and data security. And I'm sure in a few years, everyone will be talking about quantum computing and crypto. So cyber has to adapt, and it has to be an enabler. And often you're going to have to make trade-offs between business benefit and risk. CEOs, in the latest PwC survey, big theme is around elevating and accelerating change. But to do that, you're going to have to take some risks, and cyber needs to be part of that risk trade-off, which takes me neatly onto what I'm going to talk about today, cyber transparency. So given the heightened attention around this topic, there is a lot of questions and expectations from investors, the government, clients, executives and business leaders, society in general. I'm going to bring to life some of those questions, but obviously off the back of that, we're seeing a raft of new regulation in the space around improving transparency. How can people understand their risk, and how do they improve visibility? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Matt has already signposted some of the regulations that are coming along. A lot of these regulations focus on 2 things, transparency around incidents and reporting those, and building resilience. And one is improving risk management, right? Whether it's DORA, ICT risk management, whether it's the EU NIS2, and they want better assessment risks on critical assets. I thought what was interesting is the Securities Exchange Commission, the US, as of December 2023, they went live with new cyber risk management disclosure rules. There's also some new cyber incident reporting disclosure rules. So that means every listed entity in the US is going to have to disclose every year as part of its financial reporting certain aspects of how good they are managing their risk. The FRC, which is a similar body within the UK, is looking at doing the same. It's in consultation. And I'm sure that's going to sweep all over the world. So it's a hot topic. When you think about the board and their perspectives on this topic, they're on a journey. Historically, you can imagine a CISO presenting to a board once a year, once every 6 months. They go, that's interesting. Why is that metric red? Can we go green quicker, please? Those sorts of facile questions. Things have improved. We now have some metrics. So a lot of organizations are in the understanding space, but the CISO is still largely held responsible for this, right? But they're having to talk about, okay, here's some metrics I've managed to pull together, a lot of frantic behind-the-scenes data collection to demonstrate compliance. What we're starting to see, and I'd say the FS sector's ahead of most, we're starting to see some good governance. And what do I mean by good governance? It's about making well-informed choices, having a risk appetite that's meaningful, that risk appetite informing strategy. I think the point I want to get across here is there's a trend from reactive governance, where you're just challenging your CIO, your CISO on security, to actually embedding decision-making around security with all your strategic decisions. New products, new channels to market, outsourcing arrangements. All these things need to consider the risk, the cyber risk implications. I have a little example. It's a bit of a random one. It's a few years ago. One of my clients was one of the largest champagne distributors in the UK. 70% of their revenue came in the build-up to Christmas. We did an exercise to understand the kind of exposure they had to disruptive cyber attacks. And off the back of that, the chairman made a decision to change his whole supply chain operations. He used to stock up. He used to ship in the champagne last minute to keep storage costs down. He decided to bring it all forward because he knew that if he got a disruptive ransomware attack in the 6 weeks or 2 months before Christmas, he would lose 70% of his business. So that's, for me, an indication of the board taking a proactive decision around managing cyber risk. And I think that's the journey everyone wants to get to. There are very few organizations at the top, and it's hard to get there without good data. So we'll come on to that. The sorts of questions we want to ask are very simple. Getting the answers to them is not so simple. So, is our risk exposure within our appetite? Most appetite statements are pretty vague statements of like, we have no appetite for a breach, not viable. How well are we securing ourselves? How real is the threat we face? We hear a lot of noise, we hear a lot of fear. How do we make it real? How exposed are we? How should we treat our risks? Got to spend money in the right way. How can we maximize our return on investment? I've seen some huge white elephant projects in the cyberspace. Don't deliver anything. And is our insurance coverage appropriate? So, when trying to answer these questions, there's a lot of reporting. And the reporting really is across multiple layers. And I think I just wanted to bring to life that everyone's got a role to play from the operational layer to the board. So the board really should be setting the appetite. How can it set a meaningful appetite? I'm going to come on to this if it doesn't have good data. Then you've got the lines of business, down to executives. It could be the CIO, COO, whoever, or different business lines. And they've really got to focus on making sure the controls are effective, so spending their money to do that, and that they're treating their risks appropriately. To do that, they rely on a whole bunch of data from the bottom, so a lot of the space that Matt operates in, we need that data around threats, around vulnerabilities, around incidents to really understand the exposure at an asset level. So think of it as asset level data, business unit and important business service level data, and there's the enterprise. And so it's really important that works in harmony. Now, in FS, there is 3 lines of defense. There is quite good rigor around this, but they've still got a lot of gaps. But then I do work in other sectors, and it's a little bit like the Wild West. So it's a journey. And talking about a journey, the ambition for every organization is to achieve the ability to make real-time decisions around risk. We talked about risk trade-offs. So this is all about hard data to support that. So we're seeing a lot of innovation in this space. So wouldn't it be great if you could get a dashboard, full situational awareness of your exposure and your potential value at risk or expected losses across all your businesses from these types of threats? Very interactive. That's great. The reality is it's not easy. And one of the challenges, there's a lot of snake oil salesmen in this space. It's an immature industry. It's we've got this amazing tool that can do this for you. But a lot of organizations fall over at the first step, which is you've got to get the fundamentals right around what's your risk taxonomy. I'll give you classic examples. Like you might have one organization might just have a risk called cyber risk. Doesn't mean much. Or I have one client and they had a risk that says risk of malware. That's not a risk. It's a threat. Or risk of poor access control. That's not a risk. That's a control. What you want is to be able to articulate the risks you worry about in terms of business impact. It could be theft of data, fraud, business disruption. There are lots of examples. Safety considerations in the OT space. So you need to have a very clear taxonomy of the risks, how the threats map to them, and then the controls to mitigate those threats. It's quite a complex thing. There's nothing that's particularly off the shelf. You go to any like NIST, no one's got a full mapping of this. A lot of organizations need to pull this together. Now, we've invested a lot of time in pulling that together, but the reality is if you don't get that bit right, it's hard to do the rest because the risk model doesn't work. So you get your fundamentals, so you can answer some basic questions. You then really want to get to automating the reporting, because one of the great benefits of the cloud is with a click of a button, I can get a good view on the security posture of my cloud estate. Very difficult with legacy IT, so we'll come on to that at the end. There's a big challenge there. But automation is key. And there are a lot of tools out there that support this space, provided by the cloud security providers and boutiques. So that's a great place. What you want to get away from is the death by tick box checking, which we tend to see in the old ways. Like imagine, I have a lot of clients that used to assess or try to assess dozens, if not hundreds, of suppliers using questionnaires and self-assessments. They stopped doing it. It's a waste of time. They might focus on their top 5 or 10 and then give up on the rest because it's just not giving the insight and value they need. So there is a massive amount of transformation and understanding risk. The next step is to quantify risk. This is really interesting. When I come on to this, there's a difference between there's qualitative risk analysis and there's quantified risk analysis. We're talking about probabilistic versus deterministic risk modeling. We'll come on to a little bit about that. We're not going to get into too much detail, but I just think that's a really important thing because it's only when you can quantify risk that you can start articulating things in a language that a board will understand and react to. And of course, at that point, you can have much more meaningful information discussions around insurance when you're negotiating with your insurer that wants to up the premium and drop the cover limit, which happens all the time, especially with ransomware. And so you want to get to real-time decision-making. AI has a role to play here because I imagine within a few years, even 2 years even, a lot of executives will never need to read a report. They'll just ask a question. What do I need to worry about? What's my biggest risk? What control gives me the biggest bang for my buck, et cetera, et cetera. So natural language querying is going to be quite a feature in this space and in the very near future. I'm just going to rattle through a couple of examples to bring to life the difference between the kind of qualitative and quantitative risk management. Most organizations right now use a deterministic model, which is basically a good old risk heat map with a blob for each risk. The problem with that blob is that cyber attacks can have a range of impacts. And when you're setting appetites, you want to understand that range. With deterministic modeling, what are you going to model? Are you modeling the worst case scenario? The best case scenario? I don't know. It's a blob. So if you take ransomware as an example, yes, there have been a lot of high-profile breaches where it's fundamentally disrupted business operations. But for everyone like that, there's thousands of organizations have managed to contain it, and it's no news. So you have a range of impacts. You want to be able to set an appetite. I have one client, when they tried to quantify the impacts of ransomware and the likelihoods, you have these nice little curves, all right? So you have the likelihood here. Is it a 1 in 1 year or a 1 in 1,000 year? And you do your modeling. That's probabilistic modeling. And you kind of say, well, my appetite is kind of, I don't want the 1 in 10 year event. And the key control that will help mitigate that are the controls that help mitigate lateral movement. So a lot of identity, privilege access controls, all those sorts of things, which Matt pointed out. So you can have much more informed discussions around where you put your investments and how much is enough. So that's just one example. So if you see, you probably might sit in a board and they'll go, the CISO says there's a relatively high risk of a data breach. Thank you very much. What do we do about that? Or you could say there's a 1% likelihood of suffering a breach next year with more than a $30 million impact. That's where we want to get to. There's a bit of a journey to get there. If I use another example around threats, which we've been talking about previously, you have a view of threats, you map them to a kill chain, get a bit of insight around how a threat can propagate and your defense in depth controls, and you can say there's a relatively high likelihood of a successful ransomware attack given the current maturity of our controls. Okay, thank you. Or you could be saying the annual expected loss from a ransomware is $60 million, with 30% of those losses attributable to business disruption costs. Slightly different conversation. And the last one, controls. A lot of the reporting now to executives will say our controls are mostly established and well managed with some gaps, but we're largely in line with our industry peers. Although we do have some gaps where we need to improve. Okay, thank you. The problem with that type of reporting is if you're quite bad across the board, I've seen so many organizations do this death march. They call it the Road to 3 program. It's to try and get every control to at least a level 3 maturity out of 5. And they try and do it all at once. Very bad idea. It's a death march and you run out of steam. It's trying to do too much with very rare, scarce resource. What you might want to be asking yourselves is the relative contribution of each control in reducing your expected losses. So an example there, our data backup and recovery controls reduce our annual expected loss by $41 million, which is more than any other control. So that's the sort of journey in terms of reporting that organizations will go on. We'll get there. There are some challenges with modeling cyber risks. Because I said it is an immature industry, and I thought I'd call out 4 of them. The first one, we kind of already had a talk about, threats evolve very quickly. So it is not, you shouldn't just rely on historical data, you do need to rely on intelligence to think ahead. Some of the more mature organizations will actually assess and score things like geopolitical activity or signals that indicate kind of threat actor campaigns that might be coming. It could be campaign activity, reconnaissance activity, phishing activity, which could be a precursor to something. So trying to think a little bit ahead. The point is you need to pivot because static controls can become ineffective. I think we're seeing that with a lot of security operations centers in our clients, the traditional ones, which are very focused on IP addresses and traditional attacks. It's all about identity right now, and they haven't got very good identity monitoring controls. The second point, algorithmic inertia. This is actually there's a really good example of this. So the financial crisis in 2008, that's the best example I think of. Credit rating agencies had real problems appreciating the risks inherent in some of the more complex financial instruments. In particular, collateralized debt obligations, those structured products which were backed by subprime mortgages. We all saw the risk models around that. Those rating these instruments AAA, but it's backed by junk. And we saw the impact of that. Governments had to bail out the global financial markets by about $500 billion. And there was a lot of post-mortem analysis of that. And the problem was around them not keeping the models up to date with the changing environment it's trying to mimic. And that same problem applies to other risks like cyber risks. So we have models, we create these cyber risk models, some clever stuff being produced, but you can sleepwalk into unacceptable risk exposure if you're not constantly reviewing and tuning and calibrating that model. And it's quite difficult if you have a CISO who has some expectations, you have a risk model over there that doesn't understand the subject matter and they're not talking the same language. It'd be quite hard. So it's going to be an interesting challenge that people are going to start feeling when they start quantifying. Third one, I talked about this already, deterministic modeling and setting meaningful appetite. It's very difficult. We need to get away from that as soon as possible. Ironically, it's harder to do that in FS than in other sectors, because in FS there are very entrenched practices around how to report risk using heat maps and enterprise risk management frameworks. Whereas I go and talk to some of my clients in the tech sector, much more liberty to change things for improvement, because you're not having to fight the 3 lines of defense to change a framework. So it's quite interesting, that. And then the last point is around trying to mine data swamps. There's huge amounts of data available in every organization, because you've all got lots of clever tools and processes at producing data. But unfortunately, it's very siloed organizationally and functionally. I've got so many examples where I work with clients, and we're trying to get data from someone, and they don't want to give it. For various spurious reasons. It could be security reasons, it could be whatever. So bringing data together is a real challenge. So those are some of the challenges we will need to overcome. Don't read too much into this. It's just to try and explain that to effectively assess your risk, there is a complex tech ecosystem that you need to orchestrate. Whether it's all your security tools, your cloud tools, your risk management process, there's a lot of stuff. People talk about, do I use a GRC tool? Do I use a continuous controls monitor? What do I do? There's a lot of new tech coming out. The point is you need to understand there's a lot of stuff, and you need to bring that data together. And I think that's going to be, if there's one skill people talk about in security, I need more data engineers. We need some risk engineers. That's what we're going to need. So the last point I want to make is that the ultimate goal is should not be to secure your organization, but to make your organization more securable. Because for a CISO with expanding digital ecosystems, it's a game of whack-a-mole. It's really difficult. So where you want to be, the problem with that journey is that I have clients where they have a lot of legacy IT, and they say, right, we need to do a cybersecurity transformation to improve our controls. And the cost just skyrockets, because I'm bolting control onto existing IT, and it's a never-ending story. And actually, it becomes unsustainable cost-wise. You know, cost of security as a percentage of IT starts creeping up to 30%. That's insane. You don't want to be there. So effective strategy for sustainable security is where IT is modernized and digital processes are simplified. If there's one thing I would say about Google, they have very standardized processes. It makes it a lot easier to secure the organization, even though, whereas, and this isn't a criticism, it's a reality for everyone, but you know, even Microsoft can get breached because digital is such a complex attack surface to manage. If they can get breached, we can all get breached. So when you look at this journey, if you modernize your IT, you might get a spike in TCO as you're kind of juggling two environments, but eventually the cost will be more sustainable. And of course, the same story about risk appetite. As I said, it can feel like a game of whack-a-mole, but you will face a losing battle and you'll never achieve your risk posture within appetite unless you modernize your IT and simplify process. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Are you ready for some questions?
Yeah, sure.
Good. We have 3 of them. Which mitigating controls are most critical, in your opinion, to reduce the risk of data breach or cyber attack?
Yeah, I think I'll agree with Matt on this one. So definitely strong authentication, so MFA, definitely privileged access management. And in the context of ransomware and some others, some endpoint detection response controls would be very helpful.
Mm. Someone wants to know, is there any significant impact on security when using memory-safe programming languages such as Rust or non-memory-safe programming languages?
I'm going to have to read that one again.
Yeah, sure.
Short answer, not sure.
And I like this one. I'm curious if you, as a non-Swedish, can share your thoughts on how Sweden is doing in this area, since we heard you were your colleague from UK. So we're looking at Sweden.
Well, it's interesting. I came to Sweden three years ago or 4 years ago. I was on a bit of a roadshow meeting a number of PwC Sweden's biggest clients, you know, some banks and others, and listening to the conversations then, I have seen a big shift. So things like the whole intelligence sharing across industry that we heard from the Swedbank CISO, I mean, that wasn't happening particularly when I last came. It's been established practice in the UK for many years. Generally, there's a kind of the US is here, then the UK is like 2 years behind, and then Europe 6 months later. That's generally how I look at the world. But I'm seeing that being disrupted. So I listening to the talks this morning, I did see there's been a lot of progress in that space. And there was that whole talk about MITRE ATT&CK, and you know, collaborating to work out the top TTPs. It's interesting, we've had data on top TTPs for the last 6 years in the UK, actually produced by some MSPs, like Red Canary. So I think it's a very valuable exercise, but it's just interesting seeing some of the things that are happening here. So it is definitely catching up.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you, Alex. You're coming back in a couple of minutes in the panel, but you can have a seat first. So we give Alex a hand first.